So welcome to the League of Women Voters monthly series we call Timely Topics. And this month we have Karen Sims, who's going to talk to us about trauma and resilience. Before we get to that, I want to lay out a few ground rules. We want to have time for questions, but because there may be more people than I can see on the screen, if you want to ask a question, put your name, just your name, not the question, in the chat. And I'll call on you in the order in which you put your name in there. So names go in the chat, and then when we get to questions, we can take them up. Karen, do you want to have questions just at a particular time, or do you mind having questions while we're going through?
I don't mind having questions while we're going through, except for I might need help because I'm at the glasses on, glasses off phase of life. Yeah. Yeah. So I can't read the chat. So if things come in and it looks like I'm ignoring, it's because I can't look at you and chat questions at the same time.
I'll monitor the chat for us.
Okay, so thank you.
So I'd like to welcome Karen Sims to our program, and Karen is the founding director of the Trauma and Resilience Initiative. And certainly we've all been hearing a lot about trauma in our community with gun violence, trauma created by the pandemic, and I'm sure there's trauma ongoing for many reasons. Karen is a community leader, a therapist, and a nationally recognized presenter who addresses the root causes of community violence and focuses on coalition building and integrated care and wellness. And she received the Freedom Fighter Award from the CU chapter of the NAACP in 2019. So Karen, take it away.
So hello, thank you so much for the invitation. And I am looking forward to having this as more of a conversation than as a monologue. Unfortunately, I tend to put together like the dog and pony show and do more formal presentations, but I was just thinking a few minutes ago, I know you wanted me to make sure that this was relevant and practical. So would it be helpful for you all if we started off with just a few, like, what are burning questions? Like, I know one of the questions that happened before everyone was logged on was, can I get a full definition of what is trauma? I heard that clearly. Are there other kinds of questions that you want to make sure that you walk away with so that I can make sure that I talk about what's most relevant to you?
Well, that one, I think, is a question everyone has, is because we hear it so much, trauma has become kind of an omnipresent word. So knowing exactly what it is, I think would be helpful to start with.
Okay. Anything else?
Anybody got anything? Put your name in the chat. Okay, looks like we're just ready to listen.
All right. So I am going to start sharing, I hope. It's amazing, right? That's always that can you walk and chew gum kind of part of the presentation. So I am going to see if I can make that a little bit bigger. How is that?
That's fine.
Okay.
That's great.
Great. So
you may want to go to slideshow though.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Yeah. So that it clicks a little bit easier. So as you mentioned, before I get into a definition of trauma, I want to just tell you a little bit. I got to do the Trauma and Resiliency commercial. So we're a local not-for-profit that was founded in April of 2019. The only reason why that's significant to you is my mom is April 19th birthday, and she was really pleased when our not-for-profit became official at her birth month. But we started off as a working group of the Champaign County Community Coalition, looking at trauma and wanting to improve the community's understanding of trauma and also our response to trauma. TRI seems like it's unique in some ways because we're the only local organization devoted to it, but across the nation, there are about 250 organizations on the community level trying to help their communities be trauma informed. So as Trish Tricia, you said it is the flavor of the day, this whole idea of a trauma-informed community. And I want to explain kind of why it is the flavor of the day. So one of the things that we have come to learn about trauma, and people became fascinated with this idea for a couple different reasons. One, after 9/11, right, we started looking at collectively, how do communities, what's the impact of like a global or communal trauma? How does it impact people individually, on a communal level, on a family level? And then Katrina, which was another way that people started looking at the impact of trauma on children and did lots of longitudinal studies to look at that. And then as we started helping look at how trauma impacts people neurobiologically through things like the concussion study and trying to help soldiers returning from war, healing their brains from trauma, from traumatic brain injuries, we started, researchers started realizing that trauma is this broad thing that not only just changes people in terms of what you see, right? Like it's not just a subjective experience. We know that trauma, and I'm going to give you a definition in just a second, is something that impacts people's worldview. It changes people biochemically, it changes their perception, it changes their sense of well-being. And there's a lot of research around all of that. And I have simplified that into thinking trauma are things that shape people's right to be, become, and belong. And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, they have a definition where they define traumas as events, experiences, and the effects there are. So the events could be those things that you tend to think about, like substance abuse, or growing up in a household with a parent who has an addiction, or sexual abuse, or domestic violence, or family violence, or any of those things, or community violence events. But even more importantly, it's people's experiences of the events, which is why no two people who go through the same experience them in the same way. But typically, the effects of those events are painful, they're disempowering, they're shaping and defining. And then the impact of those things are they tend to make people feel powerless, hopeless, helpless. And it's not just, what's important to know, because we now know a lot about how the body responds to stress and stress hormones, is that these aren't just cognitive disruptions. Like trauma doesn't just change how you think about the world. So it's not like people can just get over it. That we now know from longitudinal studies that it changes people neurobiological. So those feelings of feeling overwhelmed or disempowered, or that are shaping and defining, change all of the, like every single neurobiological process. So like if you think about like a basic hormone that is related to trauma is stress hormone. So, right, like we all have adrenaline and epinephrine and always sort of operating in our bodies at any given time. And we can think about those being related to anxiety. When you put an individual in an environment where they've got adrenaline and epinephrine going all the time, right? We know it wears on the heart. And our bodies are these really efficient machines. And so if it's like on drive all the time because you're maybe stressed out, because maybe there's constant food insecurity, or maybe you don't feel safe because you're experiencing external or internal oppression because of any of the isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, right? Your body will say, we're not going to keep you with adrenaline and epinephrine going all the time. We're going to shift and we're going to move to cortisol. And cortisol, when we think about the long-term impact of trauma, is the chemical that becomes the killer. It changes it changes how the brain functions. I was at the coalition meeting earlier, and they were people were talking about I read, I count, and talking about literacy issues. So one of the things that we know is children who grow up in households that are highly stressed will present with fewer IQ points, and will have will present with literacy issues and learning challenges. And they've actually done some research recently where they've given families an extra $250 a month. Not a lot, $250 a month. And they found out that all of the literacy issues and IQ issues dissipate when you reduce mommy stress. So isn't that fascinating? So stress as a stress hormone is sort of the culprit when we think about trauma. And it is why, again, and I'm going to talk, because I know one of the questions that was asked in the beginning is like, what is it that individuals can do to make a difference? And so much of what we can do is actually pretty small, because individuals are this constant balance between risk and protective factors. We're always sort of having, some days we have far more resources and other days we don't. If we think about those individuals in our communities that are the most vulnerable, and if we shift our energies to be sure that there are more resources for those who are most vulnerable, we actually help prevent traumas so that people can experience adversity, but they don't become traumatic, if we can think about that capacity building around protective factors. And if we kept it simple, I'm kind of off script for a little bit, but if we kept it simple, where we're thinking, how do we support people's being, right? Like, how do we create opportunities for people to show up and feel safe and feel connected? How do we foster community sense of that allows for lots of becoming, right? So if you think about people need to become professionally and personally, and people need a right to feel like, if they need career opportunities and employment opportunities and housing opportunities, and just all of those expressions of life that we know are protective. And then people need to feel like they belong. And anytime we're giving communities or individuals messages that they're not welcomed, or there's no place for them, or we want them in some other place, we're creating more traumas, but also helping people feel less resilient. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions, because I know I kind of did like a little of a soapbox. So
not so far. So.
Okay, all right. And so so this is like Karen, and I know it's also reflected in TRI's mission and vision, but what we believe, the key to sort of preventing trauma and addressing trauma, particularly on this global and community level, is to sort of move towards King's vision of a beloved community. And, a lot of folks will say that this is why King was assassinated. It wasn't necessarily the civil rights piece, but when he thought about changing both the economic systems and the political systems and the structures, where we really thought about creating equal access for everybody across the board, those were the values that were most, ending war. Those were the values that were actually most complicated. And the more I do trauma work, and I'm also involved in some collective trauma work through a project called the Pocket Project that does things with NGOs. And I really have been reflecting on this concept about what does it take, a world without violence, right? Because trauma is a form of violence, and a world without violence means that we're really promoting equity and equality, and sense of connection and being and belonging. So that's the soapbox part of TRI, and we do that like one step at a time. I threw this in here just because this was sort of end of the year data about sort of what was happening in Champaign-Urbana. So last year, I think we ended up with 220 shooting incidents at the end of last year. We actually ended up with 9 murders, or I actually think we ended up with 4 murders in December. So I think we ended up with like a pretty high murder rate. And there were more shootings in both Champaign and Urbana in 2021 than the entire 2020 year. And Champaign and Urbana were not unique in that way. Lots of communities across the nation have experienced an increase in gun violence that's been directly correlated with the COVID epidemic. And people have like spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. But for folks who do trauma stuff, we know that violent trauma begets more trauma. We know that stress creates more trauma in adversity. And when people don't feel safe, they tend to engage in more unsafe behaviors. And then there's some other theories around access to guns that have sort of been bolstered during COVID. There have been more guns available, and there's some thought that there's been a little bit of intentionality around sort of the distribution in guns in communities that have been marginalized by COVID and structural inequalities. So I also want to mention that and then again, I will take a pause for a second. I'm hoping everybody is aware that the factors that made COVID, the structural inequalities that have made COVID really impact poor and lower wealth, or people who are having working class jobs, are the same factors that are linked to gun violence. There's definitely like a correlation between the structural inequalities that contribute to the high death rate and adverse health outcomes regarding COVID and gun violence. And Champaign County, in the state of Illinois, has one of the highest poverty rates in the nation. We've also had one of the highest rates of something, and I'm not going to really spend a lot of time, but there's a long-term study called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that looks at like people's experiences of 1 of 10 childhood traumas and their adverse health outcomes. So people who've had 4 or more ACEs die like 20 years sooner. They have far more health complications. They're more likely to experience homelessness, to have problems with unemployment, to die of heart attacks, cancer, all the top 10 causes of death. And one of the data points in the ACEs study is this poverty issue, which is the same data point around COVID, which is the same data point around gun violence. So like you could follow the thread: early exposure to childhood trauma and poverty tends to be connected to more poor health outcomes, and it also tends to be connected to community violence. So they all kind of go together. I kind of have wished, I'm going to say something parenthetically, I really wished when we were like talking about COVID, one of the things I wish we'd had a conversation about was the connection between COVID and people's experiences to childhood trauma, because all of the risk factors are the same ones that are associated with exposure to childhood trauma. So, any questions about that? I don't want to I want to make sure I'm sort of going slow enough to open it up for questions. Any questions?
I think your statistics are very informative. I mean, the people who tend to be in my organization don't tend to think of Champaign-Urbana as a poor place.
Yeah.
So bringing it home to knowing that our experience in this community is very different than the experience of a great many others is sort of an important point to keep in mind.
Yes. And we have, one of the highest rates of homelessness. And I know Danielle Chanowitz has done some research around even among young women. What she's found is that women who use like township services, many of whom the gap between the age of the children of the father and the moms is like really, really significant. So, right, so we have far more younger women who are more vulnerable, who might be like in relationships where they're doing more, where they don't have housing stability because men in power, economic power, really are making decisions, which is why we have such a high homelessness rate among young women or young women with children in our community. And if you can think about like the job market and like what's available, I tend to have these conversations with my neighborhood leaders a lot. Who feel like they're constantly, people who are entering in the job market or who are working more service related jobs, especially before COVID, felt like that they would typically be competing with students they were more desirable. So even when we think about like entry level pathways in this community, a lot of people feel like they're shut out from the marketplace. So right, when we think about that, can I become who I need to be if I don't have economic security, is a constant conversation we have on the community level.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna not really spend time here, but I want you to know, because I throw around this term all the time, and I just want you to kind of know, a lot of people talk about being trauma informed, and so I created this because it means something, often not what people when most people use the word, they mean trauma aware, so that they are increasing their awareness about trauma. They're talking about trauma more. Maybe they're recommending that people go into trauma services. What we advocate for is trauma and justice informed policies, procedures, and practices. And what that means is that what we advocate for is, in other organizations, we're not alone, but is a world where not only, and I'm going to move here, right, only are we increasing people's ability to realize what trauma looks like and feels like, in all of its various forms. So, we know like a lot of times people will be even identified as having a mental health need. And sometimes the root cause of it is trauma. In like addiction services now, many times now, they're shifting sort of the focus on the substance into focusing on the etiology, like where does it come from? Because now we know like recovery becomes much more complicated if you don't deal with why people need to use and you just focus on the using behavior. We want to help people change how the community responds to individuals who've been impacted by trauma. So the best metaphor is you see somebody, and Oprah talks about this all the time when she's interviewing Bruce Perry, but like if you see somebody who's having a grumpy day or is not super friendly, or maybe like cuts you off, if you think the question is what happened to them, not what's wrong with them, that you develop like this more curious, open, non-judgmental approach to have to explore, right? So we want to change how we respond to people, recognizing the signs and symptoms. And then most importantly, and I think from both an individual and a community level, we want to resist re-traumatizing people. I'm going to say something parenthetically, just because I know a little bit about the League of Women Voters, although I'm not familiar with the local work. My dad was really, really involved when he was in New Jersey. And I think in this moment, this resisting re-traumatizing piece is so important, because there's so much that's happening on like the social, political level, right? In our discourse that really is harmful. Like if you think about, like if you listen to the news on a day-to-day basis, my parents were civil rights activists, and I frequently talk to my mom now, who actually I talk to her a couple times a day, but we talk about the news and how heartbreaking it is that there are like, concerns about like teaching things like, like about teaching civil rights, that like is a harmful thing when you think about all of the sacrifice that many, many people have done to talk about women's rights or civil rights or social justice. And there's so many little and big ways that we re-traumatize ourselves and each other in our language, in our discourse. I know when COVID first hit, even the politicization of like mask and vaccines created some, there's a word for it in the trauma field, some moral injury, because it felt like people were sometimes making decisions that weren't about the collective we, that were making decisions that sounded much more self-interested, that were harmful to people. Like if we thought, oh, I'm going to do policies for the most vulnerable, not for folks who have the most benefit, like how would we have redesigned our responses and our conversations? So that resisting re-traumatization, it often also is something that we talk about with organizations. I don't want to keep belaboring the point. And we do that by prioritizing all the things on that outside ring. So safety, empowerment, voice, choice, having this honest conversation about culture and gender and historical issues and trust and transparency. So I'm going to double check the time because I don't want to, I feel like I'm too parenthetical. So these are all some of the variables that we, when you kind of look at Champaign County, we just thought, like, if you think about some of the social issues and historical issues, you'll see that, we have a number of inequalities and inequities, although like the median housing rate is $159,000. Again, we have a pretty significant rate of poverty. So the gap between those who have and have not. And then there are some quality of life indicators that, given our income rate, just don't kind of make sense. We have a crime index rate that's one of the highest in the state. So just to constantly be paying attention to those things. Be thinking about all of the social and cultural variables and factors, right? So unemployment, poverty. One of the areas that I know that we think about a lot at TRI and in the community is this whole conversation around education and educational access. There are definitely like health issues and behavioral issues, and then there are violence issues. And so all of these things kind of work together, and we imagine that these are all socioeconomic priorities. I know this is on the the sort of macro level, and I promise I'm going to bring it down to like, what are the things that we can do locally. This is our vision of what can happen on a community level to address trauma. So if you think about these as being the roots of community trauma, like if you look around, so a community that is and experiencing high levels of trauma, there are lots of needs, there's a lack of social connection, there's some distrust, there's a lack of ownership, people have problems envisioning the future, there's lots of instability and inconsistency and reliability. So people experience in communities that are experiencing a lot of adversity, this is what you would see, right? So these are the roots. What we hope can happen is that organizations and groups and will work together to de-escalate chaos, build social cohesion, foster community resilience, right? And these are the things that we believe are what would grow. Strong community stewardship. We want to increase the social capital of individuals and neighborhoods most impacted by adversity. We want to increase educational attainment. We want folks to have good health, good social mobility, racial equality, and stable housing, right? So if you see, if we fertilize our community, right, killing off the roots with quality, affordable housing, improving our programs and services. And then what has been most important for TRI is this whole concept of a community building, right? Where people really get to know each other, feel connected with each other, look out for each other. So instead of sort of saying that there are neighborhoods over there and there are people over there, that we continue to bridge build. Those are the kinds of things that we believe can lead to addressing community trauma and change some of those variables, and also promote economic security, right? So this is that being, I'm going to keep going, but I also just want to remind you, I told you tries to focus on not only just the trauma piece and the trauma informed piece, but we also focus on the justice piece. And so justice is addressing some of the root causes. I'm going to click through this.
So I have a question. You use the word resiliency, and I guess I would like sort of what is resiliency really when you talk about it?
So when I think about resiliency, and other people who do work, resiliency is a combination of both internal and external factors. So some of the internal factors that help make me resilient are, do I have a view? So has something to do with my worldview. Do I believe that I can have control over my environment? Do I believe that, sorry, I'm losing the internal ones. I could give you the external ones super easy. So
building resiliency presumably would mean changing someone's perception about how much control they have over their environment.
So that would actually be an external fact. I'm gonna go back to the internal and external. I just had a brain fart. So external factors that help me be resilient are, do I have recreation? Do I have play? Am I moving around? What does the built environment look like? Do I have access? I talked a little bit about empowerment. Do I get a chance to do things for myself? Because that builds sort of muscle memory. Are there places in my life where I can de-stress? Do I have good coping skills? Like if we each have our own window of tolerance, right? So one of the theories around resiliency is that folks who have a broader window of tolerance, so when bad things happen, they're just sort of like wildflowers and they don't like get bantered about. They're not necessarily emotionally reactive. They can bloom in any soil. They just sort of keep going. So those are the common, but really it's nice to think about resiliency. The other way to think about it is it's constantly in flux. So imagine if you had a car accident. This is the metaphor I always use. A car accident, but you had a car accident and you have insurance and have medical care. You have friends and family who can come see you, and it's a car accident and it's bad. But if you have a car accident and you are not insured, and you go home and there's an eviction note, and your mom is also suffering with cancer, and you're not speaking to your friends, same car accident, but your ability, the impact of that car accident really changes by who's in your life, what supports you have, both external and internal, what security you have. And it's right. So it's constantly this thing that's in flux. But if we build communities to be resilient, where again, where you have stress management and you have support and trusting adults and opportunity to de-stress, and you're not in fight, flight, freeze anymore. When a bad thing happens, you can rebound from it as opposed to being leveled by it. But when we take away, right, it's why I'm going to say something and hopefully it makes sense. It's why when a bad thing happens to folks who have more vulnerabilities, that's economic vulnerabilities, structural vulnerabilities, health vulnerabilities, or socioeconomic vulnerabilities, if we think about those social determinants of health, it's so impactful because I have fewer resources to rebound.
Mhm.
And, and it's also one of the other things I will say about resiliency is it's why the younger you are, this will sound something controversial because I grew up in a time where we thought if you didn't have words for it, it didn't count. Who was brought up that way, right? Like things that happened to you before you remembered really didn't happen. But we now know that if it happened to you before you had words for it, it actually is going to impact your body more because you don't have words for it. So there'll be a lot more neurobiological changes. So folks who had early developmental trauma, the impact is more significant. You're more likely to have back pains, autoimmune disorders, cancers, all of those things, because we're a combination of genes and triggers. And the more vulnerable we are, the more our genes get activated.
And
that's a great question.
Yeah. It sounds like, we've been following the plan that Champaign has put forth to deal with, they started off to say to deal with gun violence, but I think they broadened it. And it sounds like it might be the right direction, not trying to focus on the kids that have the guns, but trying to focus on their environment of the community.
Yes, so great. That was the perfect segue, because what we know about gun violence is if we don't think about creating this seamless web of support, so everything from prevention, and prevention are simple things like, are there lights and parks and green space? So if you think about it, if I'm a young person and I'm in a neighborhood that I don't feel safe, and it's because it doesn't look safe, it doesn't feel safe, and I'm going to do things automatically to make myself feel safe. And that could include carrying weapons because, right, it's not lit pretty well. And then I'm going to maybe develop a little bit more hypervigilance, right? So I'm going to be more on guard, looking for bad things to happen. And if I'm got hypervigilance, I'm stressed and I'm doing things to manage my stress, which probably aren't always the most helpful. So maybe I'm smoking a little bit too much more weed or drinking too much or taking substances, right? It's all kind of going together. I am probably less likely to think, if I shoot somebody, what would be the long-term consequence of that, right? So people who think like tough on sentencing works assume that people are making good executive functioning thinking when they engage in crime. That's not what the data shows. The data says it's impulsivity, it's not having good coping skills that kind of come together and turn into this toxic explosion, which is why we have to really focus on prevention. And prevention is all of those good education, community building, helping people feel safe, positive youth development. Everyone should have art, recreation, play, mommies, daddies, kiddos, everybody needs it. And we change our social norms around gun violence. And that's some of the messages. So, right, we've even said things like, put the guns down isn't a message that tends to resonate with folks who are going to be shooters, because they would go, is it just us that are putting the guns down? Are we telling everybody to put the guns down, right? So where there's those kind of nuanced messaging, it tends to sort of be a wash. But imagine if we promoted peace and promoted community connection and promoted talking things out and really change norms around our expectations around how we're going to be with each other, you know, and reduce people's need to be hypervigilant, it makes a difference. And then the blueprint talks about prevention. They have some intervention. And then one of the things that I know TRI does a lot is inevitably bad things will happen. And when folks have bad things to happen and they're vulnerable, and it becomes this downward spiral of needs because no one reached out to them. Sometimes there's stigma. If you're in a family where there's been a shooting, people see you as part of the problem. The school sees you as a problem. Your neighbors might see you as a part of the problem. Your landlord might see you as a part of the problem. And all of those things we know make people more vulnerable. And the more vulnerable they are, the more we create potential more people who might be involved in forms of violence, like domestic violence, family violence, and gun violence. So we want to say, like, when a bad thing happens to you in your neighborhood and in your community, that's the postvention process. People are with you to journey with you, to spend time with you, to help you heal, to help that bad thing not create more bad things. We want to sort of create a safety net for people. And so we have lots of, not as many as we want, but we have volunteers who help out in that process. We have neighborhood navigators that help individuals do that. And we've been really fortunate that like organizations like Bend the Arc, Moms Demand Action, sometimes the United Way have helped us put together like comfort and care baskets that we give to families who've been impacted by gun violence. And just to sort of say, and that's on any side of the issue, just to say, you know, we see you, we're with you, we're a part of the community. During COVID, we've been writing personal handwritten notes to seniors in neighborhoods that have been impacted by gun violence, just to sort of say, like, we've heard that some of you feel like afraid and disconnected. We want you to know people are thinking about you. We care about you. We've delivered like comfort and care gift baskets to seniors and people with varying abilities, because again, they felt disconnected. So what we want to do, and it's part of the blueprints, is make sure that when a bad thing happens, there's some restorative, loving postvention process. So the blueprint has prevention, intervention, and postvention all sort of woven into the healing process.
That sounds like a good start, huh?
Yeah. So I know, and I want to open it up for questions. So I know one of the things that I was asked was like, what could you practically do? And so this is a super small thing, but we do have a task force, and we that's organized by the coalition, the city of Champaign, that meets. And we always could use like different ideas. I don't know if you tuned into the coalition meeting, but the Ministerial Alliance was talking about its 48 days of peace, and the 48 hours of peace that's going to turn into like a 48 days of peace. But all of those ideas, people who come up with those great ideas that we share across the community, kind of get germed in that in the task force. We also always need, if you're aware of a group that you think hasn't been heard or listened to or talked to, we're always trying to kind of go out and listen to those voices. I mentioned if you ever see yourself as a part of our response effort, we also have this vision, and Dr. Mendenhall at Carl and at the University of Illinois, and I've been talking about this, where we would love for people to be available to administer something called psychological first aid and skills for psychological recovery. They're really practical things. In Washington State, in Wisconsin, and in Philadelphia, they've been doing this, where they've got lots of people every block who just are sort of available to help respond to their neighbors and friends when there's a crisis, that helps kind of restore our sense of community. inviting your friends and family to an event where you're having these conversations. I think that part of what we're not doing enough is having more complex conversations. I know the Race Relations Subcommittee has a number of different activities. I can't encourage you enough. I mean, I would love to encourage you to be involved in all of the activities they're doing.
So Karen, if you wanted to be involved, who would you contact?
Oh, great. So you can, and I put some contact information in here. So you can actually reach out to See You Try. You can also reach out to Mary Catherine at the City of Champaign. She's the Fresh Start coordinator. She and I co-facilitate the Community Violence Response Task Force. So we do that. We have a listserv. I also encourage you. You can also reach out to the City of Champaign, the Coalition's Walk as One Facebook page. They are really responsive for that way, because they're always looking for volunteers. And then I know Penny is on here, and she, if you go to the Coalition's website, how to get in contact with the Race Relations subcommittees here. But I also know, I saw Penny was on here, and she's also really involved in the Race Relations subcommittee. Can't stress, they're just doing amazing work too.
Okay, so it sounds like working through the coalition that they can sort of direct you to opportunities that they know about.
Absolutely. And they're also working on a large community calendar so that you can see all the kind of activities that are happening in community. Everything from, help, they're looking for more literacy readers for I Read, I Count, which is a healing strategy, right? Helping people helping kiddos read. Lovely, great idea. I know there will, issues around voting. All of those things will come through the coalition. They're always looking for help.
Okay, good to know. So let's see, we've got a couple questions here. Prashan has a comment. Maybe Prashan, you would like to say that yourself. If you can.
Oh, sure. I was just plus wanting something you mentioned when you were talking about resilience. I like that you described it as being able to bloom no matter the environment. Because, as someone that's marginalized myself, I grew up in Garden Hills neighborhood. So I'm among the many marginalized residents of Champaign, or at least have grown out of it, as they say, and was what many labeled as a resilient child myself. But it wasn't until you used this specific language that I was like, oh my God, it was like a light bulb went off. Like, our marginalized community members are really challenged with blooming in environments that aren't equipped to nurture them, at least in healthy ways. Yeah. And so being resilient is saying that I'm going to grow despite my environment. And so I just really appreciated that. So Thank you.
And what I would love for it to happen one day is that people would have the resources that, more folks would be involved in making sure that we've increased people's capacity. We've given opportunities. I'm trying to figure out how to turn off my PowerPoint. We've given opportunities for people to have the tools and resources they need, to thrive.
Okay, and you referred to Penny. Penny is here, and do you want to describe what you do, Penny? You can unmute and talk. And you're working on getting your PowerPoint down, right, Karen?
Yes, I am.
Good to see you, Karen. So my name is Penny Soskin. Thank you for having me as a guest. Annette Lansford let me know about this, and I came to one of your book clubs before. I'd love to join you, but I think I can't join anything more without having to be active. So if I give something up, I'll come and join you, but you do a great job, League. So the Race Relations Committee is a subcommittee of the Community Coalition, and this is something you really might be interested in the coming weeks. is that we are opening up with a collaboration with United Way, viewing of a documentary, a 40-minute documentary called Open Wounds. It's a story of intergenerational transmission of trauma, just as Karen was talking about, going through 3 generations and how that plays out. So United Way is sponsoring the release of this in the community over the next 4 weeks. It might be something that you and your members would be interested to view either individually or collectively, and then come together and have a discussion collectively. The Race Relations Subcommittee are providing, discussion questions, ground rules, etc. So if you're interested, you can sign up. There will be invitations going out very shortly. Sign up, view it, and then come together as a group to discuss, or however you want to do it. But I did put my email in the chat, but I think I managed to mess it up. But I'm just PennySoskin@gmail.com, and I'm just one of a team. The team is all volunteers. I'm just a small cog in that wheel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Penny. So I know there must be more questions out there. So why don't you put your name in the chat and we'll talk about that. David,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I put my question in the chat. I don't know if it went through, but can I ask it now?
Yeah, I don't see it. So why don't you ask it?
Well, I was wondering how many violent crimes are committed in our area by young people from single parent households, generally speaking, and what active steps are being taken to promote 2-parent households? It seems that so many times we read in the paper and elsewhere, we hear from people, and the mom is the one who has all the pressure. You know, she's got so much on her plate already, as was indicated earlier tonight. And yet I saw nothing mentioned about that. So Karen, can you talk about that a bit?
So right, that it's hard to have that as an abbreviated conversation, but I will tell you the economic issues. So people who research what creates relationship stability have done work to say, when you increase economic opportunities for men, particularly men who have had, I'm going to actually begin that conversation in a different place. So if you follow the narrative about how we got here, we actually have, particularly if we're going to think about community violence, we have more single parent families now than we have ever had in the African American and Black communities. And there are lots of reasons about how we got here. One of the reasons why we got here had to do with the large incarceration rate that happened because of the war on drugs. So we actually had, we started off actually before then. So we took 1 in 8 men from urban communities and they went to Vietnam. And right, we know what happened to people after Vietnam. Those same folks, right? So we already decimated communities where we removed large segments of men. Then we went right from that into the 80s and 90s and had an aggressive war on drugs. And in some communities, 1 in 5 men were incarcerated and gone from the communities. So, right, we're already talking fewer people. If you look at stats, fewer men are available. Then you take them away from their ability. So, right, how do you learn to be in a relationship, have economic stability, how to be a good father? All of those things happen through witnessing and observing, right? So when I think about like collective and communal traumas, when you go from Vietnam to the war on drugs and you look at the large number of incarceration issues, and then we look at economic issues, right? So although we currently are like in a job boom, men who've been formerly incarcerated still have hard time being employed. We also have a benefit system that does not prioritize 2-parent families. Actually, we make it more complicated. We've got nothing in place in communities because we're segregated that teach people how to stay in relationship together, how to be parents, how to how to function as a thing. And as long as there is economic stress and social pressures, and we're having a large number of people who are incarcerated, no one will be stable enough, right? People hypothesize like, will be stable enough to like do the 2-parent families, because it requires, for those of you in long-term marriages, right, requires a lot of skill building. Some of that's modeled and mentored and opportunities for that to happen. Right, there are a lot. This is Karen. I believe the more we can deal with the poverty issues, the economic issues, and increase employment opportunities for those who were formerly incarcerated, and then also do capacity building around mental wellness, helping people kind of understand, like, in order for me to be in a good relationship with you, I've got to be mentally well. I've got to have the capacity to not use drugs, not want to self-medicate, I've got to have some affect regulation. All of those things go together, and we don't have a good mental health system. We don't have a good economic system. We haven't built the capacity. And I'm with you. We don't have, right? Very few places have these conversations, right? Around how do we stop a tide? How do we deal with structural inequalities and inequities in a meaningful way? Because a lot of times we do symptom reduction, right? We want to we want to kind of deal with what people can see without really looking at those social determinants of health that we know, based on data and science, help make relationships last, help men stay around. Right. I'm going to say my last thing. I don't know, you guys know, but there's like the cat theory and the dad theory of fathers, right? So there's one theory that says guys will have children and stay in place and maintain long-term relationships with their children's mother when they have economic stability, have the ability to sort of be recognized in, unfortunately, classical patriarchal kind of structures, right? The dad theory, when men feel vulnerable, don't feel like they are empowered, valued by their families and communities, they tend to operate with the CAD theory, right? So they'll have multiple children without like long-term commitments. So the more we build up economic capacity and create more opportunities, the better we can get folks to function as dads.
That sounds good. What about a two-pronged attack, though? You know, more educational emphasis on household relations, especially in high school, maybe even elementary school. What do you think? Maybe some of that is going on now already. I don't know that, but maybe it is.
There is some education around, right? So there have been several different programs in town that are around relationship education. And unfortunately, sometimes there's a pushback around relationship education, but I will say on a practical piece, knowledge and behavior, there's no correlation. So you can teach me great skills, but until you also increase my capacity to internalize those skills, it's just great information, right? Lots of people write amazing books about relationships that have poor relationship skills. It really is an inside out. And so I will say, from my perspective, a lot of the school interventions that are around, that are teaching students like affect regulation and how to deal with stress and how to have conflict and how to have restorative circles are those key relationship skills that we know tend to help us stay around when we're trying to make love last or we're trying to stay in relationships with each other. One
more quick question, then I'll stop. What about any attempt to reduce teen pregnancies?
I think one of the things I hinted at, probably didn't say, I mean, we've done a better job of reducing teen pregnancy, so that if you look at the data, that we're actually making progress. Who knows what's going to happen with some legislation that we might, as we restrict women's access, we might see a return, but we've done a better job of addressing teen pregnancy. But I will tell you again, if if I am I'm going to try to figure out. So I talked about the age gap between fathers and many young girls who happen to get pregnant locally frequently have partners who were significantly older, like anywhere between 8 to 10 years gap. If I'm making those decisions, and sometimes we would say that those are probably not always inherently consensual relationships, because if I'm 15 and you're 25, right? Like that's a significant developmental gap, age gap, the whole thing. As long as we have locally 1 in 4 young girls, 1 in 5 young girls, probably higher for girls of color, who are vulnerable to sexual assault and sexual violence. That's a form of sexual violence. You're probably not going to have a huge impact on that other part of the teen pregnancy, because it's not always purely consensual in the classical sense of the way. If I'm having compromised relationships because I don't have negotiation skills and I don't have the ability to say no, it's not a lot of teenagers now, because we have done a better job of doing sex ed and explaining things. It sometimes really is that age gap where there are older folks who are taking advantage of younger, vulnerable girls.
Okay, Karen, we've come to the end of our promised hour, but I want sort of one last question. I know some of us are feeling kind of like things are really bad and they don't seem like they're getting much better. And I'm really hoping you can tell me that you see some hope for our community, for locally, for the way we're doing things. So can you do that?
So the fact that there are 30 people on a call on a Wednesday night is a sign of our community's capacity to be loving and caring and generous. I have had the privilege of just knowing about just how many people throughout this community are concerned about the care and well-being of their neighbors. They're concerned about being involved. There is lots of engagement and conversations. There's a commitment to justice and equity and all of those things. That's part of the way
work, right?
Yeah, that is definitely part of the way forward. And the other thing that I will tell you that always gives me hope, I think I mentioned that we've been doing some door-to-door work, and I am amazed at how receptive the community is to help in relationships and understanding. I love going door to door, and I'm amazed at how diverse our neighborhoods are. Like typically, right, there's a conceptualization that neighborhoods that are impacted by community violence have like one demographic, and I just don't see that. Like every neighborhood I'm in, there's so much different diversity. So I am always hopeful about that. I know through the Community Violence Response Task Force have like asked for volunteers to come out to neighborhood events and community events. And sometimes, right, like we've had like 75 people at the Legion in the middle of COVID, right, where people just from the community have come out wanting to make a difference, wanting to be involved. I'm hopeful about the Blueprints for Peace. It is completely aligned with every single evidence-based practice that exists. Like, you know, we're in a university, so if you were going to take the best practices, condense them down, the blueprint is really, really promising. And the fact that local government has bought into it also gives me hope. So the fact that we're dialoguing, that people are willing to do the work, that people are putting sweat equity in it, that there's investments of capital. And when I also look at like school board meetings or county board meetings or all of those things, I am still always impressed with how many people who are concerned about issues like educational access and equity and, you know, just making sure our community works well together. You know, people will come out for streetlights. Those are the kinds of things that I think build a community together and provide opportunities. And I think we will also be, I would hope this, and my hope and wish is that we will continue to stop that people will make solid commitments to address those structural inequalities and inequities that have been longstanding. I believe that a lot of times when we thought about civil rights in the beginning, we thought about hearts and minds. Right. No, I think we thought like we could change hearts and minds through changing policies, procedures, and practices. And increasingly, I believe that we also need to do it in a relational way. We need to be in connection with each other. We need to have loving and open conversations. We need to stay in community. And I see those seeds growing all the time, and that gives me hope. So
thank you. And I think there is a lot more information, a lot more knowledge and research about what the real issues are, and that can really inform our decisions, and that's really good. So I want to thank you, Karen. I've learned a lot tonight. I really, really appreciate your giving us your time, and I'm hoping that we'll find ways to get involved and help make our community better.
And your work is so important. So I really, really, really appreciate the invitation. It was such a pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, with that, we'll end our meeting. This should be posted on the website within a couple of days if you want to tell your friends to watch it. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.